let's get started. So everybody sort of got introduced a little bit earlier, and now I want to sort of lead with this very loaded question, and maybe this is where I should confess that I actually am a resident of Queens. Right? When it comes to innovation, does Brooklyn actually mean something like discrete and definable? Can you nail it down to a single description versus Manhattan, where people a lot of times think of Silicon Alley as being, say, Flatiron? And I'm wondering if you think that there's a difference between the scene in, say, Manhattan and what it means to be an innovator in Brooklyn. Do you want to start down on the intro?
Sure. So I think there is actually a difference. I've funded 11 companies out of my fund, which is the first and only venture capital fund to be located in Brooklyn. And when I started it, I thought that maybe a quarter of the companies would be Brooklyn-based companies, and I'm happy to say that 6 out of the 11 are Brooklyn-based companies. And I think one of the big differences is actually the most interesting stuff is going on away from the quote-unquote center of the community, right? So if you think startups are cool and you used to work at a bank, you immediately run towards the center, the first thing you find. And what's the first thing you find? Well, like Fred Wilson's blog and General Assembly and like all these things that are like really useful, but the most interesting stuff tends to be going on from people who are in some random warehouse in Brooklyn and have to look up what VCs are on the internet. Like, it's people who have unique insight into what they're doing, and their attack of a problem is a little more organic. And I don't mean like organic in the food Brooklyn kind of way, but it just comes because they were really like interested and passionate in something, and they were the right person to do what they were doing, and then they sort of accidentally discovered the startup thing and VCs and all that sort of stuff, right? Those are the companies that have like a really intense passion about the problem in their DNA versus somebody who wakes up and says, I want to start a company today. And the latter is a lot of times just not as interesting. And so I think if you're here and you're building, you're definitively choosing to be away from the noise, and maybe a little closer to the roots of how you discovered the problem in the first place.
See, I think it's really interesting when you go to events and people identify themselves as like startup groupies, which is, I don't know, it seems like such an interesting phenomenon, and maybe you see more interesting things here. No, Jesse, I'm wondering what you would say.
Well, I think
just can you tell us what you do?
Yeah. Probably workshop doesn't mean a whole lot to a lot of people. We're an intentionally small company, a group of graphic designers who seem to be doing everything nowadays except graphic design. So we spend a lot of our time right now working on a conference called Brooklyn Beta, which is about to happen in October. And wow, thanks. I hope a lot of you are going to be involved in that. It's a crazy adventure that we've been on for the last 4 years. Going way back, I just want to tell Steve that I used to work in Milton Glaser's office, and when Steve first was around talking to Milton about, and he was like, we're going to do the B with the 2 dots, and it took a lot of faith to to say, yes, the B. I mean, I feel like this was the first Brooklyn brand, truly, like we're gonna put a stamp on it. And so anyway, it's exciting for me to be on a panel with Steve. That's my graphic design roots, but now we're doing more experience design. And I didn't even know experience design was a thing until I'd been doing it for about 2 years, and somebody said, oh yeah, like they work at an ad agency in the city, and they were like, oh yeah, that's what our experience design department does. I was like, yes, we are the experience design department. So that's my background, and just in terms of what I would say about innovation is, I think Charlie's right on. I mean, innovation means new and different. I just looked it up because I wanted to make sure I had that right. It means just something new and different. That's innovation. And I think what's new and different about this area is that people don't wake up and say, I want to build something. People say, I want to live my life. And I want my life to be awesome. So how do I figure out how to create a job, create a company, whatever that is, around my life? And it might mean getting off of that traditional track. It might mean getting off of that startup, whatever that thing is, that ride that people get put on. And just saying, what's right for me? And I think here in this area, there's just a large concentration of people who are willing to ask themselves that question and then have the courage to take steps in that direction.
I see. Now, Scott, you sort of have it, in the name and just to sort of bounce around the order here. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about, like, you've organized this entire thing for us to discuss this. What do you think this means? What does Brooklyn innovation mean as opposed to the rest of it?
Right, and so you and I actually had a really neat talk about this on the phone, and the question of, and I think we'll get to some of these questions, but what is Brooklyn innovation? I mean, to me, Brooklyn is an adjective, right? And it is an adjective that reaches way beyond the geography of this space, although the geography of this space allows the kinds of things Charlie was talking about, the warehouses full of weirdos who are actually making crazy, amazing stuff that your head will just explode about. I mean, for everyone here in this, having this incredible beer, look around you. I mean, look at the walk if you didn't take an Uber here, right? This is an insane thing that has happened, right? In a geography that is fundamentally both unique and uniquely suited to the kinds of fringe companies that, as Charlie articulated, are making the stuff that are going to change our lives, because suddenly innovation is moving at a pace that is like science fiction futurist insanity, right? And if you're like sitting in Manhattan in some place, I mean, Manhattan's great. And Manhattan is, Brooklyn. I think what Brooklyn represents is amazing. I view Manhattan through the prism of Brooklyn, and I'm like, so it's still cool, because for anyone who likes Manhattan, you get it's just a shade of Brooklyn, right? Which, may be crazy. But but the stuff that's, the stuff that Charlie was talking about can only happen in this space. And the geography and the people make that, make that all possible. We built our entire company around it. We started a traditional company, an old-fashioned company. We started our company with incredibly proud, my brother and I, Danny, about 12 years ago, we came up with the idea. We launched over 10 years ago with the Elle magazine, and we had printed up, we don't have a website. Right? Great idea. Why? We thought that was cutting edge. Oops. I remember some dude was talking to us, he's like, hey, Scott, you should meet the Docker guys, they're doing something cool. I'm like, is it a website? Yeah. We'll just watch them try to make money, right? And so, we didn't necessarily get it, but what we did get was Brooklyn, and that the people who are engaged in this space were going to change the whole world, and that's what's happening. I don't know if I said anything.
I think there's also an element of diversity of perspective here that's really important. If you guys live in Brooklyn, you are friends and neighbors with people who actually grew up here. Whereas if you ever lived in Manhattan, no one seems to have actually grown up there.
Charlie just wants us all to acknowledge that he was born and raised here.
We're friends with Charlie, which is how
Mr. Brooklyn right here.
It's funny because I've spoken in front of mostly city audiences and people, and they're trying to scale these big companies to millions and millions of users, even though their own social sphere is basically all of the same kind of person. And you ask them questions like, oh, you think your social network is diverse, but how many of you are friends or neighbors with cops, firemen, or sanitation workers? And in Manhattan, that's not usually the case, but in Brooklyn, you live next to people who've been here, you have a much more diverse perspective on who your eventual user base will be, because they're not necessarily, rich Manhattanites. And I think that really counts towards a lot of the social products people are building, and they're building for more than just a lower Manhattan audience, and that's really important if you're going to scale.
Speaking of scale, I kind of want to bounce this question to Steve in particular, and I think that the Small Knot story is a really good lead-in for this. I think people associate Brooklyn with sort of this idea of, craft, artisanal, handmade, small scale, well-made, and as somebody who sort of built a business around something that's very well-made, but it's built a large business, do you think Brooklyn is incompatible with scaling a business?
No, not at all. I just want to go back to the first question. I came to Brooklyn. I moved to Brooklyn in 1984 after living abroad for 6 years and growing a family. And when we returned to New York, we couldn't afford Manhattan anymore with 2 kids. So we settled in Park Slope. I was a journalist, like a lot of other journalists and writers live in Park Slope. And that was what brought us here. But when I began to dream of starting a brewery, it was kind of surprising how much support there was for entrepreneurship all around me. There was a woman who lived on our block in Brooklyn on 8th Street named Sophia Collier, who had started a company called Soho Natural Soda. And Soho was really the first of what became the new age beverage category of soft drinks. Challenges to Coke and Pepsi, which were completely dominant at that time. And Sophia gave Tom Potter, my original partner, and I advice in the very beginning on starting our company. We built it, had done our wonderful logo, we had a test brew, and we had Sophia over on a Saturday morning. And we showed her the beer, and she said, yeah, that's great, it's really cool, the beer tastes great, but this is not going to work unless you distribute your own beer. And I remember saying, distribute beer in Brooklyn? I can hardly afford my car insurance. What about parking tickets? And what about the mafia? Which is something all of my original investors raised. And she said, yeah, there are a lot of problems out there. But she told us about starting out with Soho and going through health food distributors. It failed. Soda distributors failed. Beer distributors failed. And she said she didn't establish her product until she put it in the van, put her logo on the van, and went out there and peddled it the way entrepreneurs have been doing in New York for a long time. So we took her advice and we contracted to produce our beer outside of the city, scrapping our original plan to build a brewery on day one. And we focused on building our brand before we invested millions of dollars to build a brewery in Brooklyn. And along the way, I realized there's a tremendous history of entrepreneurship here in Brooklyn. There were fabulous companies like Pfizer. The air conditioner was invented in Brooklyn by a guy named Carrier. And in my time, actually the first cooler, wine cooler, was developed in Brooklyn with a terrible name, Calvin Cooler. But that was the beginning of, a serious category in the beverage business. The guys who created Arizona iced tea are a couple of real characters who I met when they had a malt liquor called Midnight Dragon. And these guys are like Mutt and Jeff. One guy's like 6'8" and the other's 5'8". They would put on tuxedos, rent a limousine, in a swimming pool in the limousine, filled with ice and Midnight Dragon. And they go out into Bed-Stuy in East New York and pull up to a block and go up onto the stoops and take the warm Colt 45 out of the hands of the drunks and give them an ice-cold Midnight Dragon. And they were amazing guys. Actually, John Farrellino, one of the guys, told me a story about going in to collect money from a Yemeni deli out in Bed-Stuy. And the guy owed him a lot of money. And John went in with a ball bag and slammed it on the counter and said, "I'm not leaving until you pay me." And he said this Yemeni guy raised an AK-47 up behind and said, "Get the fuck out of my store." So, I mean, there, you know, the outer boroughs are where things are created by people who are there because they can afford to be there. And Manhattan, you know, Manhattan is really, it's really become for only for rich people or people who have inherited wealth, I think. It's so expensive to live there now. And Brooklyn has become a great place to live in addition to a great place to start a business. Yes, our company is getting much, much bigger, and we are going to be doing a big expansion here in Brooklyn in the next couple of years. And we've got projects going now in Sweden, and probably we'll do something in Berlin, and probably in Korea. And you know, the name Brooklyn is an amazing calling card. And back when we first had the idea to call it Brooklyn, actually it was Milton who I wanted to call it Brooklyn.
He convinced you to just call it Brooklyn, right?
I wanted to call it Brooklyn Eagle Beer after the old Brooklyn Eagle newspaper because I used to be a newspaper man. And Milton said, "Look, you got Brooklyn here. Forget the Eagle." But originally there were people, including some of our original investors, lifelong Brooklyners, who said, "Are you sure you want to call it Brooklyn? Not sure how that's going to play out in the suburbs or, you know, elsewhere." But it's worked out great.
I feel like that story about collecting the money it really puts anybody's attempt to get on TechCrunch in perspective, frankly. Jesse, Scott, I was wondering if you guys had anything to, you know, if you guys had any thoughts on the sort of the you know, the question of, you know, I guess it's kind of a question about like staying true to your roots a little bit, keeping it real, if you will.
Yeah, I guess we are taking Brooklyn Meetup from something that has been a really as intimate of an experience as you can have for 300 people to this year we're going to have one day that is going to include 1,200 people, which is incredibly scary for us. Just from like logistically, like how many bathrooms do you need for 1,200 people? That's a lot of bathrooms. We should talk more.
Learn from my mistakes.
We got a lot.
You need more than you think.
Yeah.
It's not good when you're wrong.
No, we don't ever want to run out. But I don't know. I mean, I think the great thing about Brooklyn that I said before was just that scaling doesn't necessarily equal a positive or negative thing. There are people who want a big business, and there are people who don't feel like that's for them. And the great thing about this environment is that I think we all respect those choices that we want to make for ourselves. And we let each other make those choices. And I would hope that people aren't judging our success or failure based on how big our company has grown. It's, to me, the success or failure is, are we enjoying ourselves and are we putting something out there that is valuable to other people, and are we having a positive time doing that? So scaling to me sort of seems irrelevant. Some of these businesses in Brooklyn obviously won't scale, and I think that that's kind of what's beautiful about it. Like if you have an artisanal, you're making this thing, do you really want to be able to make 1 billion of those things and ship them worldwide? They would lose their value, they would lose their unique value. So scaling to me isn't necessarily a positive or a negative thing, it's a neutral thing. There's a lot of room here in Brooklyn. We have a lot of space though.
So I think we're gonna actually, because the barbecue is here, I can smell it, and I think it's the goal of this tonight is really to have us posing the question. questions, and then to go out there and talk about it over food and drink. I want to thank the New York Observer and Kelly and all of our speakers for making participating. Thank you all for coming. We're all going to be out there drinking and eating for the next hour or so. So thank you all. Let's keep these conversations going.